You should see that pop up on your screen. Lovely. So welcome to our webinar today. This is hosted by McGraw Hill and Open University Press. The theme of today's event is Widening Access to Higher Education in the UK. And we're going to have a discussion that will be chaired by Harvey Wolfe. First of all, I just wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping for you. So my name is Bryony Waters. I'm in the marketing team at McGraw Hill. We have a wonderful panel of experts. They're going to introduce themselves shortly, who will be speaking today. We'll be having a discussion for around about 35, maybe 40 minutes on some themes in widening participation. And we would very much encourage everybody who's attending today to pop their questions in the box as we're going through, please, because we'll be having a Q&A session at the end. So my colleague Emma will be putting those questions from the Q&A box into the panel at the end of the event. And she's also going to be monitoring the chat box. So if you do have anything you'd like to raise during the event, feel free to pop that in the chat box too. So yeah, just a couple of housekeeping notes. So obviously you're in a Zoom meeting, webinar. You should be able to hear and see the panel. As an attendee, you won't be able to speak yourself or turn your video on, I'm afraid. This is a broadcast webinar. I recommend that you close down anything on your computer that's using a lot of connectivity, just to make sure you get the best experience. We are recording the session. We will be sharing the recording with everybody who's registered for the event. We'll also be popping it on YouTube, so we're very happy for people to share it further with their colleagues as well, please, afterwards. Okay, and it would be remiss of me to not mention that the reason we're all gathering today is actually to launch a brand new book that we published just last month. So obviously that's forming the basis of the event today. All of our speakers on the panel have contributed to this text, which is on widening access to higher education in the UK. I'm going to ask each of the speakers in a moment just to introduce themselves briefly and maybe talk about their contribution to this book. So we've got a number of our chapter authors here. And then Harvey, I'll hand over to you. And if you wouldn't mind putting some questions to our speakers on some of the key themes, that would be wonderful. Okay, and Harvey, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yes, I'm Harvey Wolfe. I used to work at the University of Wolverhampton, where I'm now an honorary research fellow. And together with Wayne Turnbull, we've edited this series of essays on the broad themes of credit and its use both in the UK and more widely in Europe and internationally. And I'm very pleased to say that we've got half a dozen of our authors who have contributed to those chapters. So perhaps we could start off by asking Claire to briefly introduce herself and identify some of the key themes of her chapter.
Hi there, everybody. So Claire Dunn here. I'm the Senior Manager for Recognition of Prior Learning at the Open University. So I had the privilege of writing the chapter with Liz Marr from the university. So prior to kind of my role at the university, I was a lecturer for HE programs in FE for a number of years, where kind of the transition of these learners into kind of level 6 study very much kind of relied on appropriate credit recognition and transfer. So from that, I had a real kind of invested interest in the role that I do before I joined the Open University. In terms of kind of our chapter, it very much focuses it's written very much within the context of the Open University and through the lens of the Open University. Within the chapter, we try to focus on our kind of approach and use of credit and how we value credit within the market. And we also try within the text to kind of address some of the sector issues which continue to be present around the kind of use of credit in terms of recognition and transfer.
Thanks, Claire. And perhaps we could now move on to Maeve Parish and Rosemary Morland, who contributed the chapter on Northern Ireland.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me.
That's fine. Yes, yeah, certainly
yes, can. Okay. So I'm Maeve Paris, and together with Rosemary and 2 other colleagues, we've jointly authored the chapter on what's happening in Northern Ireland. We have a particularly distinctive HE landscape, and credit is used in a particular way in higher education in Northern Ireland to enable widening access and participation. In fact, it's centrally planned and monitored and evaluated and embedded in each higher education institution. and is measured through annual widening access and participation plans. So widening access is ultra important in Northern Ireland, and one of the ways it's achieved is through progression pathways with credit transfer, through our own unique access to HE diplomas, through foundation degrees, and through APEL, which is covered in the particular chapter. There are just a few things that are particularly distinctive about the HE landscape in Northern Ireland, which have implications for widening access. Full-time student numbers are still capped for us. We have what we call the MASN cap. So that's a maximum student number, and that's allocated to us on an annual basis through the Department for the Economy. All higher education institutions in Northern Ireland have their own MASN allocation. And another peculiarity is that our fees are much lower than the rest of the UK. So that's a particular feature of full-time study in Northern Ireland. As usual, nothing is ever straightforward in Northern Ireland. So while we have a devolved administration, which has been in place since 1999, it's actually been absent for almost 40% of that time. So we have difficulty with, say there was an absence of government for 3 years, and there's currently another absence of government. So the problem is that many of the strategies that we have for widening access are starting to look a little bit old and tired at this point. And most of the administration is now in the hands of civil servants who can only go from year to year with plans. But despite all of this, widening access and participation is ultra important and is strongly embedded in Northern Ireland. And I'm going to hand you over to Rosemary, who's going to tell you more about the actual ways in which this is implemented.
Okay, thank you, Maeve. So Rosemary Moreland here, also at Ulster University. I've been working there for over 30 years. And my role has been, traditionally with adult students and non-traditional students, and I've been very much involved in looking at, I suppose, more innovative and creative ways of ensuring that particularly, adults who have been failed by the education system do have pathways of progression through into further and higher education. So part of my role in the past has been as an access manager with the FE colleges for the Access Diploma in HE. I've also been a Pell champion in our faculty, and I'm being particularly creative around how we can create a progression route of accreditation for prior experiential learning onto the degrees. So we talk about this within the chapter, taking, I suppose, 2 case studies. So as Maeve's already given you kind of an overview and an outline of the general, I suppose, thrust of our chapter, I think it's particularly interesting to look at the 2 case studies that we provide in the chapter. So one is looking at the foundation degrees, which Maeve has a very big role in within the university of overseeing those, that the foundation degrees are very much the government's preferred intermediate qualification, which they are run through the FE colleges, and the university partners with the FE colleges and with that arrangement to allow for that progression through into higher education. Which is, of course, fraught with a number of difficulties, which if you go in to read our chapter, you'll find some of the challenges that exist in actually making that happen. But as I say, I think we're very creative and innovative around how we do that. And their second case study then is the APEL pathway, which I have championed along with my colleagues in community development, who are also co-authors in this chapter. And really, it links in very well actually with Claire's chapter on the Open University, which talks about how that need for the recognition of prior experiential learning, and how that it is very much down to the market demands and the whims of course directors, and that's something that we have been, as I say, very committed to ensuring that happens on the part-time degree in community development. So if people want to go in and read our chapter to find out more about that, we'd be very happy for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. The other contributor we've got who's looked at the UK landscape is Bob Morgan. Bob, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm an economist by academic background, and taught basically international economics and European economics for a number of years at the university. Also taught quite widely in Europe and America at the University of South Florida in Tampa. Um, I moved on from teaching university, and then actually became involved in building international networks for the business faculty at the University of Glamorgan and then the University of South Wales after it was involved with a merger with Newport. The chapter, I suppose, concentrates on two aspects of this, which was devolution. I don't think you can talk about Welsh education without talking about devolution. And secondly, it was, I looked at Bologna and Brexit. And underlying those two themes was the notion of you can't talk about credit without talking about trust and social capital. Whenever credits are involved with accumulation and transfer, I think it's so important that trust is established between the participating networks. Really, really important. And I know we've been asked at our discussion not to be too political, but Brexit absolutely shattered that bloody trust, you know. And I've been involved with meetings with German universities who said, you know, can we actually trust British institution in terms of credit transfer and credit accumulation? That's really it, really. Didn't become involved with granular analysis as such, but I tried to keep my chapter as general as possible and looking at some quite controversial themes. And there we are.
Thank you, Bob. So Bob's link with Bologna takes us very nicely into the second theme of today's presentations, the whole issue of student mobility. And there's some interesting issues that Anne Danby approached when setting up a consortium of UK universities that she's going to tell us about. Anne, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Harvey. So as the screen says, I have had a somewhat random career. My HE career started in Cardiff, where I was a student, as indeed did Wayne. And I went off and did all sorts of exciting things in the fields of ecology and forestry. And as you can probably see, fungi, I'm a mycologist, really, underneath it all. But that networking aspect of fungi actually comes back out into this world of credit and social mobility. I can pretty much segue fungi into anything if I work hard enough at the analogies. So within HE, I've done a lot of different jobs. I started off Derby working on regulation. RPL, of course, was part of that. And I moved into quality and curriculum design. And it was during those central roles that I became involved in NewCat, which brought me to a whole group of very interesting practitioners who were interested in credit and student mobility and solving some of the exciting challenges that the HE sector throws at us on a pretty regular basis. So that's my background. Now I have headed off into the dark side, back into science and engineering. I'm course director for the School of Built and Natural Environment. So that means trying to make biologists, geologists, civil engineers, architects, people who blow stuff up in quarries all talk to each other and improve the quality of their courses and their learning and teaching and assessment strategies. So yes, sort of back out at the chalk face, if you like. My chapter was born out of a really interesting project that came my way. At the time, our Vice Chancellor was President of Midlands Enterprise Universities, and at that point it was 6 institutions. It's since grown its number to 7, with De Montfort coming on board. And they talk about themselves as entrepreneurial universities working together to boost the regional economy. So the idea is they work together as kind of a little gang in some ways, looking for ways that we can sort of become greater than the sum of the parts, if you like. And there are various different projects, but the project that I'm talking about originally was sort of an idea for almost like, well, we've mentioned Brexit, free movement between the institutions within the Midlands Enterprise Universities. I think initially the vision was to be very radical and perhaps not need to go through traditional RPL processes. It also came about because of the introduction of things like student protection plans from the Office for Students. And what would happen, I think a couple of institutions had their Tier 4 license revoked, for example. What would happen if we could no longer offer course A to students? So we ended up with this thing which was termed the Godzilla plan. If Godzilla came and stamped all over the nursing school at institution X, what happens to the nursing students? Can we just send them to institutions Y, Z, and they'll be able to carry straight on? So that was part of the discussion, but the rest of it was about student mobility, lifelong learning, and whether students actually know that they can move institutions. Obviously, the change to continuation metrics. So if a student leaves your course at your university, if they continue in higher education, it's no longer a negative mark against your institution. That changed the conversation. So whether students are aware of this, and to be fair, whether we could keep them within the MEU rather than them heading off to other institutions. And if you look at the participants in the MEU, Birmingham City, Coventry, Derby, Lincoln, NTU, and Wolverhampton, these are pretty, well, not completely, but in the main younger institutions that perhaps sort of want to have a bigger grip on that sector. Some of them do a little better than others, perhaps. So that was the theme of my chapter.
Thanks, Anne. And that leads us, I think, very nicely into the broader issues of student mobility, which, Volker, you picked up when in your chapter. Would you like to tell us about yourself and your chapter?
I can talk about my chapter, you mean?
Yes, please. And just tell us about yourself as well.
When you asked me whether I could or not, I thought I got the role of weeping along and being sorry for the British, I'd say British, to leave. And it was a shock. And I, first of all, didn't understand why there was this vote taken, but I had to agree it is the political will, and we had to start. Look, I started my career at the university now nearly 50 years ago, and my first idea was to develop a study program in business and management, which had an obligatory year of study abroad in England, later on France, Spain, in 27 countries, and not only a study period, but also a placement. And the placement we saw at the beginning, so that the students picked up the language better, and then went into the university where we had agreed, and as was said earlier by Bob, trustful working together with the colleagues. And trust was a key word and still is essential. And, in those ICP days of Erasmus, one knew each other, one met each other regularly. And I must say, my children still have godfathers somewhere, or I can see the results of all this cooperation because I still have these close partnerships. However, with the beginning of Erasmus, Then things changed. It started to change. And at that time, I went to Brussels. I kept my teaching role, but I went to Brussels to work on these cooperation offices like Erasmus. I worked more for COMET in those days. That means cooperation between industry and university. And I started in these discussions with ECTS, later on became a counselor and also developed the first and the still valid second guide of ECTS. That's one thing I really got very much interested in. And trust was something we had to work on, and that was the basis, yes. But in the ICP days, the cooperation agreements were made between institutions. And how could you then translate close partnerships, friends, at the institutional level? And many felt sorry for that. I think it was great that this movement was made, because then it forced the institution just to say, oh, it's not just a sportive arrangement between these and those persons. It's something which has become part or will become part of our mission. And that I liked very much. And when ECTS began, it was, first of all, something we learned a lot from your country. Of course, there were others as well. But we on the continent, we had a few difficulties with understanding. What we jump on are immediately figures. Figures we can see and we can add. That's easy. But to get the philosophy, what's behind the figures, is extremely difficult, still is. And there have been many, many, many battles around. This is why today I'm very much more involved with saying ECTS as such on their own are empty. There's nothing. So when we want that it becomes currency, we have to start perhaps with the way of thinking, how did currency begin? Well, you could speak of the Bretton Woods system. That means there was a relationship to the reserves and gold reserves in those days. And I think this we had to learn. What is the relationship of the ECTS figures? And obviously, and not understood at first, and still not understood by everyone today, is the close link to the learning outcomes. We have difficulties in formulating. We think this is just funny. It's blah, 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 and don't really see the relationship to establish something beyond trust, if you may say so. We trust the system, but not is it only that we know persons. We can really trust the whole currency systems. And that is so important, because institutions today are very proud of saying, oh, we have 100 contact points, 100 cooperation. But what does that really mean? And that is why, for me, the whole idea of learning outcomes, ECTS, and of course, the concept of workload is extremely difficult to understand. Or
that's a really fascinating. You raised lots of fascinating issues, which I think, James, you address in your chapter in a variety of ways. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and just say a bit about the issues that you raise in your chapter.
Thanks, Harvey, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is James Keeley, based in South Africa. I work mainly in Africa. I've partnered with Beverly Oliver, an Australian, on this chapter. We decided not to speak cricket or rugby, by the way, just to make sure that we just got this chapter done. Our chapter focuses very much on digital credentialing and looking forward, looking beyond the UK, looking beyond Africa or other continents, and what does digital mean for us? What are the risks? Commodification is a very serious risk around when we talk education and digitization. Data privacy. The GDPR is important to you in Europe, but of course there are other data privacy issues across the world. And then of course, how do we quantify credit into something that is more digital? So I think our chapter is quite interesting, Harvey, and I'm happy to stop here and I'll take some questions just now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. Are there any questions, Emma, that have emerged from the contribution so far that we ought to take?
Yes, there's one question that's come in, and that's from Wayne. So Wayne's asking, the award of credit for prior learning can be a lengthy and bureaucratic process in UK higher education. What can universities learn from the credit systems and processes run by the Open University?
I guess, Claire, that's directed to you.
Yeah, that is, yes. I think by our very nature, in terms of how we set up our kind of, credit recognition, credit transfer processes, the very essence of it, we deem credit, to be equal regardless of where kind of it is coming from. And I think the process that we have in place kind of enable that to happen. We have a centralized credit transfer centre that kind of, will make assessments based on our criteria. But the criteria has nothing to do with kind of context, if that makes sense. So it will be the value currency of the credit, regardless of where it's been achieved. So we, I think, in terms of our processes, very much view credit as equal and have that trust in other kind of institutional practices in terms of the award of credit. And I think having that centralized operational process in place enables us to ensure that we are being consistent in how we are recognizing credit that is presented to us for recognition by learners. I don't know whether that kind of answers your question, but
Wayne's nodding. Yeah. Rosemary, and do you recognise anything of that in your experiences of applying RPL to the Northern Ireland situation?
Yes, well, I think it's interesting, what Claire was saying there. And as I said, even within her chapter, she also does recognise it even within the Open University, whilst there is that centralised admission system, very often it can come down to the sort of the individual. And I suppose actually when you look at, and I can't remember now who one of the panelists was mentioning earlier there about the focus on learning outcomes, and I think, this is, for me anyway, where I have, I suppose, been acting as an APL champion, across the university, where I maybe have been consulted by various members of academic staff across many different disciplines. I think very often it comes down to this notion of the learning outcomes. So, for example, if someone on a program, in order to get advanced standing or get admission onto the program, they have to be able to demonstrate that they have already achieved certain learning outcomes. So whilst I agree with what Claire's saying, is certainly, I suppose, in terms of having those sort of rigorous systems in place that you can ensure that there is equity across the board, I suppose, for anyone who may wish to apply using RPL. At the same time, I think there has to be a certain amount of flexibility, and that's certainly something that we have been very keen to build into our recognition of prior, particularly around experiential learning, because if you have a learning outcome, then you can, there are many different ways in which a prospective applicant then can meet that learning outcome. So I think it does require a certain amount of flexibility on the part of the, and if as a course director, you have a subject expertise, so I think you can make, that sort of individual decision based on what an individual learner comes with. And I think if, the whole idea, I suppose, of the credit accumulation and transfer, if it's to have any sort of real meaning and value for progression for learners, then I think there has to, always has to be that amount of flexibility built into it.
That's really interesting. So you've got your hand up.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute and failing to hit the right bit of my screen. Yeah, I think that flexibility thing is really important. I know when we went through the process of looking at whether we could jump over the RPL requirement with the Midlands Enterprise, the credit compass, we kept coming across problems. For a start, module sizes were based on different credit, you know, some of them were 15 credit modules, some of them were 20s, so you've already got kind of a mismatch there. I think the whole question around learning outcomes, at what level you're actually looking at them, we're internally in Derby, we're just having a look at sort of future assessment strategy and talking about whether module learning outcomes are actually a useful thing at all, or whether we should just be looking at stages. So that's quite an interesting conversation, very early at the moment, so I'm not going to say that we're trailblazing anything just yet. But then, of course, you get your PSRB requirements as well, and that's where that subject level, those program leaders or course directors come in. You know, we've recently reaccredited with the Royal Society of Biology, and they require whole skills passport to go alongside. So you've got RPL for credit for the academic part, but we will also need to be trying to assess the skills that the student or the applicant has. So it would be really nice to be able to streamline these very onerous processes, but actually I think that flexibility, that subject knowledge and that level of scrutiny is important, because at the end of the day, that student is going to graduate with a, you know, whatever their top award is from your institution, and you need to feel confident that they have actually hit all the things they need to do to be a graduate from that program, from your institution.
James, you've got your hand up, and Claire, you've got yours. But James, you.
Thanks, Harvey. I would challenge colleagues and people on the call around understanding how learning outcomes can be used to describe all types of learning, formal, non-formal, informal. And therefore, do we still need RPL or APL or PLA or whatever you want to call it? If we're able to digitally capture all learning, and I understand there's an argument around codification and that some learning is tacit and it's not always explicit. Our technology has grown so much, so exponentially in the last couple of years, that we are now able to codify a lot of the learning not previously possible. If all learning can be captured and we can compare different types of learning on platforms and online, doesn't this kind of hold a new era for us going forward, that where the formal and the non-formal come together in ways that we would never expected it, where this kind of vision of lifelong learning of the 60s and the 70s for the first time can be realized? And what does that mean for universities and credit systems internationally? So just a bit of a challenge, Harvey. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a really challenging comment. Claire?
I think what I wanted to add really was, I think that one of the complexities comes when we're trying to kind of recognize learning through this map across learning outcomes, and that we're trying to kind of, look at the equivalence of what a learner has studied in their prior learning context with the module learning outcomes of the specific modules for which they want to seek recognition for. And we do try and, advise our academic staff who make those decisions not to be looking for 100% match in those learning outcomes, because we know that there are differences in curriculum design that exists across the sector. But what we do have, and I think what makes it easier, is when we can award general credit exemption for the learning, and we do that against our open degree. So actually that's where we really truly do look at credit, and we're looking at the true value of credit, because what we're not doing then is we're not assessing the intricacies of the learning outcomes of that credit against the specific modules. We are able to take the credit that a learner comes with in its entirety and say, yes, we will take that and award you general credit for that against our open degree. And as a direct consequence, the majority of our credit transfer students do join our biggest qualification, which is our BA BSc honours degree, because it gives that greater flexibility in what we can recognise. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Claire. Volker, you're on mute at the moment.
You are right. I always forget. Sorry for that. I'm astonished that you mentioned learning outcomes without referring to the qualifications frameworks, in which we have descriptions of learning outcomes. You may say at a very general level, yes, but you can break it down. That means through your system of quality assurance at a specific institution, they have to prove that the program they offer, of which a module is a part of it, is on that and that level. And of course, you finally come to the point where you do not speak of a perfect fit, 100%. This is never the case. You can always interpret, but the best fit. And I think that is something we have to learn. So I'm working presently in many countries, having the national qualification framework, breaking it down to either the sectors like your benchmark statements or at an institution. And I think this is one of the extremely useful points we could learn, at least I have learned. Start in your institution to question, what is our degree, let's say now a bachelor degree? Well, you always knew what bachelor is or was, but in Germany, we haven't. And when the Bologna process came, we switched from one day to another. Instead of diploma, we said bachelor. But when the colleagues were asked, well, what are the specificities about bachelor? No real answer, blah, blah. That means we are not able as academics, sorry, you are able, we are not able. We learn how to express what we actually have as learning outcomes, which are smart. They have to be measurable. There will be others which we cannot measure, but okay, but they are measurable ones. And that is a way how I think we could learn from each other and work with each other much better. But you have to start at your institution, I'm sorry to say.
It's interesting. Volker mentioned something earlier on, and it struck me about the nature of trust, etc. And there's a law in economics called Gresham's law, yeah? And basically it says that bad money drives out good money. And I think that, I never thought of it in this way before, but if you don't trust each other's credit rating, and that can be in terms of learning outcomes. I know there are major issues about workload between us and Germany, etc. You know, that is really, really important that everybody's on board and knows what a credit is in terms of level, in terms of learning outcomes, and in terms of study programs. I put together quite a big dual degree program with the South Wales and the Duale Hochschule in Baden-Württemberg, yeah? And that was a massive, massive, massive task. For one thing, it had unconventional learning in that they were part of the degree, or a lot of the degree is based upon work-based learning. And they were awarding credits for that, you know? And there was great suspicion, in fact, in the UK, is can you award credits for actual work experience? And I'm sure those of you in the past will have realized, some people say, why don't you use the sandwich element as part of the degree classification? And we went through hours of saying, you know, how can you get, is the student having the same experience in the different firms we go, you know? So it just struck me, Volker, when you were saying that Gresham's law applies to credits, you know, that if they become watered down in any way, you get reputational damage, a la certain universities in Wales, for example. I don't think I need to mention them, but you know, very, very. I never thought about it in economic point of view before.
James, is anything you've heard giving you optimism that we are moving?
Harvey, I'm seeing a lot of movement from where I sit into Europe, a lot of work around digital platforms and systems being developed. So I think that the point that Volker made around qualifications frameworks, I'm seeing a new generation of qualification frameworks emerging. These are frameworks that are digital, that are based on platforms and are strongly orientated towards data privacy. The concern around this, of course, is that it becomes commodified and you get this extreme influence of the private sector, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, it can disadvantage those with lack of access. So what I see, Harvey, is a new generation of qualification frameworks. And a couple of countries and a couple of regions are definitely ahead when it comes to this kind of new thinking. And I just see universities and colleges that are keeping up with this are really doing well. But the majority, I think, would see it as a threat, to be honest.
Could you say a bit more about that, about where the experiments are working so effectively?
Malta is a country that stands out, that has really done well around this area. There's some work in a strange country, well, not strange, but countries that you might not expect, like Croatia. You see, even on the African continent, work happening in Tunisia and Morocco around this. And then, of course, more first world countries, the US has done a lot of work around credentialing through the Lumina Foundation. I will talk to the Groningen Declaration Network. Herman is actually on the call. He just can't speak today. But there are examples across the world. The ENIC-NARIC networks of the past, those of you that are familiar with them, I think are starting to transform into this kind of new space. And when you talk to them and talk to the different constituents, you will hear these discussions happening around data privacy, interoperability. So this terminology that I think that the world of technology is starting to merge with the discipline of education and training. So the examples are out there, there's no doubt.
That's really interesting. What is it, do you think, that has driven places like Croatia to develop in the ways that you've described?
Maybe I think the opportunity to leapfrog, Harvey, not to take 10 years to get to where the first world countries are, but to leapfrog. And technology enables those countries to move much quicker around how their systems articulate, to avoid silos, to define credits and learning outcomes in similar ways, and therefore I think just to move quicker. So I would argue there's some economic factor. I saw a McKinsey report just the other day that actually linked GDP improvement by at least a percentage point to the use of digital identity, for example. So all of a sudden you see reports with empirical evidence coming out, and it's all interdisciplinary, which is the interesting thing. The interdisciplinarity between education and the economies of this world, and I heard Bob talking about the economics, but also the technology. And so I think the key driver, Harvey, would be for countries to develop economically, but by leapfrogging, because the technology is now available.
Does anyone have any comments on James's analysis? Interesting, that link between education and the economy in a rather different way from the one I think we perceive it, don't we? Emma, are there any more questions that we ought to be?
Yes, and actually there is a question directed to James. James, do you think, you point out about the credit relates to the type of currency used, be that traditional qualification certificates or the more contemporary digital badges which individuals can choose to share?
So my point, Emma, just to respond to the question would be, we're using the term credential fluency in some of the work we're doing. In other words, does it matter whether it's formal or non-formal? Because if my learning can be captured electronically and verified, by the way, so I think Wayne or Bob, you spoke about trust. How about if we move from human trust to, I suppose, in some way, trust in technology? With blockchain, there's an immutable record of how things happen. So nobody can question when and how the learning happened. With AI and new forms of technology, we can test competence in an online, very effective way that is fair across countries, across universities, across institutions. So all of a sudden, I think a whole notion around how we did things in the past is being challenged. And I would give to critics that were saying, well, be careful because just don't put all your trust in the tech. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I'm seeing Fortune 500 companies in the US that use a 2-minute AI exercise to appoint their staff. They don't look at the qualifications. They use the simple AI exercise, and based on that, they appoint. And they've got incredibly high success rates. And I think it's time that these worlds start coming together in the work we do in higher education as well.
Trust has been one of the words that's, I think, permeated the whole discussion so far. And I was wondering, Anne, how far in your discussions with the consortium has trust been a critical factor?
That's a really interesting question, Harvey, because the very first thing that we did in each of our institutions was consult with people within our institutions about this idea, this thought about having students able to move pretty freely within the group of institutions, and it absolutely all came down to competition and concern that perhaps all our students would just go to Lincoln or and yeah, there was a lot of reticence about the idea because we've moved into this competitive marketplace scenario, and of course for a lot of post 92s or you know, we don't feel like we're necessarily the top the preferred destination for the majority of students, so there was a lot of concern about potentially letting a few more head off. As I said, the difference in the continuation metrics helped a little bit for those of us who have to chase metrics, but there's still the bottom line, isn't there? You know, there's still whether you're going to have enough students to pay the bills. So trust from the point of view of sort of land grabbing, I suppose, was a little bit of an issue, but trust in terms of trusting the quality and standards of the credentials from other institutions was, interestingly and tellingly, never discussed. It wasn't discussed at all. There wasn't, you know, I mean, it was very much a group of institutions in the Midlands, and most people knew each other. So we were aware that there are these regulatory checks. At the time, there was this concept of you know, 10 hours notional learning time per credit. Of course, we know that that isn't necessarily set in stone anymore, but I don't know if any other institutions have decided to completely revamp what the notional amount of learning is per credit. I should imagine we're probably all just going to leave it how it is because we've got a reasonable feel for how that is. But that was never an issue, quality and standards. It was just how we aligned the curriculum and the credit frameworks in terms of module size to oil the wheels.
That's really interesting. Did institutions have to give up anything in order to become part of the consortium?
Well, the consortium itself is very wide ranging. So this was just one project within the Midlands Enterprise Universities. They're very much about engaging with business and making sure that the graduates we produce are meeting the requirements within the region, so that we are, you know, absolutely serving our local economies, if you like. So I'm not aware that anybody had to give up any. I did write the word sovereignty actually on my notes, because there was some discussion about, you know, would we have to align curriculum so that students could just move straight? But that becomes impossible. Everyone makes modifications every year, got different PSRBs. You know, we quickly ditched that as a plan to have a total framework of, if you're doing this course here, you can go here, here, or here without any sort of checks and balances, if you like. So no, trust in terms of quality, not an issue. It was really about if anybody was going to make a land grab for cohorts of students. It was finance that was the bugbear.
As ever. Claire, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, we interesting kind of points that you said there, Anne, and picking up on kind of this idea of trust. I think, you know, we've talked a lot about that kind of, you know, credit that's achieved at formal university institutions, but I think trust goes beyond that, and trust in each other's credit and what's being awarded. But, you know, having that trust of credit that is awarded and delivered within other context outside formal university settings. So I'm, you know, referring to kind of learning that takes place within the further education sector, and having trust for the quality assurance practices of other awarding bodies that award credit, that are not universities, but do award, you know, credit at level 4 and 5, for example, and having trust in their practices so that we can recognise that learning as being equivalent to what is delivered within formal university settings. So things like, for example, Pearson HNDs and HNCs, they're delivered at level 4 and 5, and they're Ofqual regulated, and it's having that trust as well in those processes which we are developing as an institution, and we're developing these progression agreements with further education colleges in recognition of those Pearson HNDs and HNCs. And I think that is going to become more prevalent with the upcoming lifetime loan entitlement. There's going to be more push on us to trust study and practices that takes place outside formal university settings, and that takes place within you know, FE colleges, to bridge that gap between you know, different forms of study.
Thanks. Volker.
Yeah, I like to come in here, and because I think trust is, of course, a catchy word. We had that, but it is it has to become concrete. Let's put me like this. Our aim, I hope you have similar ones, are to recognize any achievements a learner has achieved, has reached. That means it could be formal, it could be informal, it could be non-formal. So the question is not where some person and through whom has learned something, but what has he or she achieved. And for this achievement, we have to find, let's call them measurements. And we have to be careful, because if these are learning outcomes just on the surface, they are copied throughout the world. You know that James mentioned Africa. I'm just designing qualification framework in Somalia, and I see I've been on the Balkan. They just copy others which have been accredited within other national environments. So we have to make sure that our qualification frameworks, the institutional ones, match with the sectors, match with the national, match with the European, or as wide as possible, African, continental, etc. That means the trust comes on basis by assuring through the respective organizations that the quality is assured. And if they say it's level 6, it is level 6, independent of what the subject is. Level 6 says that you are, let's say, able to criticize or have a critical approach to literature, for example. And I think these are the ones. So learning is not the subject. Learning is what is behind. The subjects are your vehicle to learn. I like to stress that. I designed MBA programs in Germany. We didn't have them in those days. And I may say the best students I ever had through MBA students were non-business graduates. And that taught me the lesson that it is really important, or not important which subject you do, but what you achieve. Sorry.
That's a very telling point, Volker. Rosemary.
Yes, sorry, I just wanted to come back in actually on earlier points that Claire were making, and I kind of feel, here we're, I suppose, in some senses, all very committed, we're to this idea of widening access, increasing participation. In some ways, we are maybe preaching a little bit to the converted. For me, really, the elephant in the room, which I think Claire kind of brought up, is the whole neoliberal agenda, really, which has pushed the further and FE and HE sector very much into competition. So whilst I think everyone here is very much committed to ways in which we can use credits in innovative and creative ways to increase participation of non-traditional learners, but the bottom line is that there are many within our institutions who are dead set against it, because and I think certainly Claire has talked about that in terms of that alliance which they have managed to create. But it's when the bottom line, where somebody's going to lose students, which means losing money, which means losing staff, all of that, then that's where I think the students, really, those learners, lose out completely.
Thanks. An important point. I'm very conscious we've got a couple of minutes left. Emma, just checking if there's any more in the question box.
We have got a few questions. I'm not sure we'll be able to get through all of them just with the time left, but maybe the final question, do the panel think that we need to do more to help the student population understand the positive benefits of transferring, as against the sense that moving to an alternative institution is due to their ability not being the correct fit? And do we also need to do more to assist students and colleagues in understanding the credit system and the qualification framework?
Thanks. Perhaps we could go round the panel for their thoughts. James, should we start with you on that one?
I think we need to build our future systems around the students, and digital identity provides that opportunity, and it would solve a lot of the issues we spoke about today. Thanks, Harvey.
That's Claire.
Yes, I do. I think there is a lot of work that we need to do to support students to understand the system, and to make it easier for them to navigate through and understand where they could transfer their learning to. I think learners are kind of left to navigate and try and find their way themselves, which potentially then leads to them disengaging in higher education, full stop, and they become a lost learner as such.
Thanks. Anne?
Yeah, I also agree, and I did read some interesting reports while researching my chapter about just that, about student awareness of what they can do, and how much flexibility is actually built into the credit transfer system. I'm very clear when I'm teaching students about how the module is set up, because that's something they don't necessarily understand. And I think we assume that everybody involved in university will know how these things work, but actually it doesn't hurt to be absolutely explicit about things. So yeah, I think there's plenty more that we can do.
Thanks very much. Bob, your thoughts on that question?
Ditto really to everything. I've said that the terrible thing to say, the ignorance of students never ceases to amaze me, actually, in the system they're actually in. But I've been thinking and cogitating what we've said, and I'm talking about the metrics of the credit. How do we measure learning outcomes? So many hours per credit. How do we audit that? And crucially, I think what we tend to think of is, what is the role of the external examiner? Now, I've been an external examiner in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, and Wales, and my experience is eclectic, put it like that, and I really don't think we've got a handle yet that students get the same experience and the depth of learning outcomes, because external examiners is a thankless job. You can come under so much pressure, for economic reasons on occasions, you know. I just think perhaps we should pay more attention to auditing the actual credit.
That's an interesting one, Bob. Maeve, your thoughts on the question?
Yeah, I think our key mechanism is really foundation degree through to degree articulation. And students, we like to make it as easy as possible for the students. In a sense, we try to conceal the mechanism so that they don't have to worry too much about where they might potentially go. We have worked out articulation agreements. We have mapped the credit transfer. We have extensive documentation, but really all the students should need is a simple graphic which shows when you start this way, you can continue on down the line. So in a sense, we like to conceal as much as possible, but and just map out pathways that students can follow and do all the necessary paperwork behind the scenes. I do think often it's more of a challenge for me to get my colleagues to understand that those agreements are in place, and that it is quite transparent, that if you go this way, we'll allow you to transfer the credit and we'll make sure that the PSRB accreditation or whatever goes with it. Sometimes my colleagues don't see that quite as clearly, and yet it's a fundamental underpinning for widening access and transferring credit, particularly in our university.
Thanks. And Rosemary?
Yes, I would just completely support Maeve and what she has said there. I think whilst it's useful that, you know, that students should be armed with the information that they need to make the choices they want to make, ultimately, I actually think it's about educating our colleagues and incentivizing, you know, those pathways for progression for learners.
Thanks. And finally, Volker, your comments on the question?
Yes, I think it is, of course, important always to enlighten the students, but the problem are the teachers themselves, at least in Germany. Maybe it's different in your country, but we are too conservative. We don't dare. We have built our ivory towers, and therefore it's extremely difficult. It starts with the terminology. Simple things. You use the word qualification. What does it really mean? You speak of modules. What does it really mean? This is different in all the countries, and we have to find a common basis for that. But you see, at least the German university teacher is, per definition, I think, conservative. If you start to introduce distance learning like we had in the pandemic, extremely difficult. So let's start with ourselves, at least in my country, and include the students as much as possible, but not only the students, also the other stakeholders. I think that is really important. This cooperation of university, industry, the society, this should be one. Sorry for saying that, but that's my feeling.
I think that's a view that we'd all share. The chair is traditionally supposed to summarize pithily the discussion that's gone before. It's far too wide-ranging a discussion, I think, for any pithy summary. So I'm going to duck out and just simply thank everyone for their contributions, for raising a whole series of issues, many of which we haven't had an opportunity to explore, but many of which I think we've opened new doors to exploring in the future. So thank you very much. Thank you too for the questions. And we look forward to further discussions about credit, which hopefully the current British government proposals about England, and I think Wales, Bob, might encourage in the coming months. So thank you very much. And thank you to Bryony and Emma for organising the webinar.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to all of the panel and everyone that's attended today for their contributions. Thank you once again, and congratulations on the publication of such a wonderful book. I do hope that everyone finds it useful if they're listening in today. And I'll be sharing out the recording, as I mentioned at the beginning, following the next couple of days. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.